with the release of Debian 13 Trixie, the so-called universal operating system made the not-so-universal choice to drop support for the 32-bit x86 ISO. 32-bit in Debian is often called i386 and various other places out there. This is not a great term because this also refers to the 8386, which is a much, much older Intel CPU. It was 32-bit, but there were a lot of changes over that line, so eventually the term became i686, and a lot of people don't know that term, so they don't use it, so just say 32-bit x86, and that is the most clear term we have. Along with this, they decided to no longer keep building the 32-bit x86 Linux kernel, but they did keep building various other 32-bit packages they had, because these do have a use case outside of just a 32-bit system. Notably, when it comes to doing Linux gaming, there are some various other use cases, but that is the main one to this day. But when this happened, a lot of the discourse expanded into a lot more than was actually happening. Debian is dropping 32-bit full stop. That's not exactly what took place. Right now, with Debian 13, there is still ARM HF. This is 32-bit ARM. It's a confusing term because there's lots of different terms for these, but that is 32-bit ARM that is still actively being supported. Along with this, you have a bunch of other random supported architectures, some of which are 32-bit, most of which are very, very dead, not just dead architectures, but dead in terms of support as well. Go have a look at the Debian ports. These are the official ports. Most of the other projects, those are entirely unofficial and are very, very dead projects. But the main point is 32-bit x86 is not supported by Debian 13. However, when Debian makes a major change like this, it isn't just done out of nowhere. When Debian has a new major version, the old major version continues to be supported for some amount of time. However, that time eventually has to run out, and that time is basically now. Debian 12.15, this is the 15th and final update of its old stable distribution, Debian 12, codename Bookworm. This is the last version of Debian that supports x86 32-bit. However, there is no need to scramble and immediately change this very day, because this version, as per the Debian documentation, is going to be supported until the 30th of June, 2028. Of course, it's Debian, and if you're on Debian, you're going to get what you get on Debian, but it is still technically supported until this date. And I guess if somebody wanted to, they could go and make an unofficial Debian port, because there are 32-bit x86 versions, notably the Herd version, which is a different kernel than what you get with Linux, but it does exist, and you can go and use it, and people are working on it, so a regular Linux version wouldn't be impossible to see. Whilst I would consider this a pretty big deal for a project that calls itself the Universal Operating System, it's not the first architecture that Debian has supported, it won't be the last, but it is one that a lot of consumers do have experience using. With that being the case, the transition from 32-bit to 64-bit CPUs happened a very, very long time ago. If we're talking specifically consumer CPUs, that was in 2004 with the Pentium 4 from Intel, and 2003 with the Athlon 64 from AMD. With Windows 7 in 2009, that is where 64-bit operating systems became the standard on Windows, and then a couple of years later, the same thing happened on Linux. At this point, basically every single computer is running a 64-bit operating system. And especially if we're talking about something released in the past 15 or so years, there's not really any reason for running a 32-bit OS. If you want to, you could, but you're just kind of doing it because you can. Again, we are specifically talking about 32-bit x86. If we start talking about ARM, and we start talking about some of the just weird Chromebooks that exist out there, there were 32-bit ARM Chromebooks being made for far too long, up until a couple of years ago. That's a whole nother story. However, Intel actually was still producing 32-bit CPUs up until 2019. I don't mean the whole Intel 83, 86 and how they were producing those for a really long time as well. I mean an actual real chip that was released in the last century. That being the Intel Quark line of SoCs. Here we're talking about embedded systems. This isn't something you're running in your main system, but they did exist. And now you know. So let's say you do have a system where it makes sense to run a 32-bit OS. Let's say you have a laptop from 2007, where yeah, you could run the 64-bit variant, but with something that old, you're not really going to benefit from it, and frankly, it might actually be a worse experience than just running the 32-bit version. With that being the case, what options exist now? What actually happens, and are there distros out there that you can still use that are not just old, unsupported operating systems, but distros that are still being developed to this very day? The options are a lot more than you might think. Now, it's not going to be your Ubuntus or your Fedoras or these other major mainstream distros. However, there are still some really big options you can go with. Notably, Slackware. Slackware is still doing the Slackware thing. They're still being Slackware. Yes, Slackware does move at a pretty slow pace nowadays. It's going to be running a pretty old LTS kernel. It's going to have some pretty old packages. It's Slackware. It does kind of take its time. But it's not the only option. You also avoid Linux. They call it x86. This is 32-bit x86. This still is around. You have Alpine Linux, which, to be fair, I would say Alpine Linux is probably more of the universal operating system at this point, because they do support more architectures than Debian does, and one of those is x86. That is the 32-bit variant of x86-64. Again, there's 20 different names for this architecture. Nobody uses them consistently. It's a mess, but that is the version we are looking for. There's also Gen 2. You can just go and run Gen 2 if you want to. Yes, the main version is the AMD 64 version. This is x86-64, x64, Intel 64. There you go. There's some more names to not remember. But right down the bottom here, x86, that is your 32-bit x86. And whilst not being the main version of the distro, there is Arch Linux 32. This is a fork of the main Arch Linux project. It does heavily rely on what Arch Linux is doing, but do keep in mind it is technically a separate thing. Whilst all of these options do exist, and all of them are great options to go with, there is a bit of a problem, because there used to be a lot more of these 32-bit distros. I say distros in air quotes because, like a lot of the distros out there, they just take a distro that exists, make some minor modifications to it, fully rely on the infrastructure of the main distro, and just, that is it. Those being things based on Debian. There were a lot of these 32-bit distros that just relied on the fact that Debian provided this support, and when they stopped providing this support with the switch to Trixie, they either died overnight, or just accepted the fact that they're now a 64-bit only distro. One of those notably being MX Linux. When this happened, when Debian stopped building 32-bit kernels, they basically said, 32-bit support's done. Now, they are very closely related to another project known as Anti-X. And with Anti-X, they do still provide a 32-bit version for those older machines if you want to. With these projects being so closely related, they could bring that kernel into the MX Linux project and have that 32-bit support around. They decided against doing that. However, the option is there, and you could just go and do so yourself if you really wanted to. Whilst Anti-X is based on Debian, they had been building their own custom kernels for a very long time, because whilst support was there in Debian, in a regular modern Linux kernel, a lot of older hardware tends to kind of start regressing and breaking because a lot of people just are not testing it. That is what was happening with the 32-bit support, so NTX was just going and doing it themselves, making sure this worked, and sort of like going about their day. So when this happened to Debian, it just didn't affect them because they already had a contingency plan in place anyway. They were already doing their own thing. Then we have everyone's favorite, Puppy Linux. Puppy Linux is a great option for reviving old hardware if you just, don't want to deal with Arch and do things yourself. They do have a Debian variant, and their Debian variant does have a 32-bit version. So they are still going and doing the whole kernel thing themselves. But they also have various other bases. They have a Ubuntu base with a 32-bit variant, which actually is kind of nice. They have a Slackware variant and also a Void Linux variant. All of these do have a 32-bit version, which is very, very nice to see because you don't just have to rely on what the project is giving you. You can actually package things yourself. This is not every single thing. There are projects like Damn Small Linux, and you'll see a lot of these distros that are intended to revive old hardware do still have a 32-bit version, but we are seeing less every single year that passes. This is the direction that things are going. We're not going back to 32-bit hardware, and a lot of people don't have the hardware, so a lot of people just don't feel like working on the problem. However, if you're willing to look outside of the Linux world, there are more options to go with still. Now, I already mentioned it earlier, and if you're willing to go with something which your experience is going to be very questionable, there is the 32-bit version of Debian GNU Herd. This is using the GNU kernel, which through a bunch of circumstances didn't come out when it was supposed to, ended up first properly releasing after Linux started, and then Linux basically stole all of the hype behind this project, and curl, I think just barely, very recently, actually got working, like solidly working 64-bit support. So Herd is a while away from ever even considering dropping 32-bit. Now let us move over to BSD land. FreeBSD notably dropped all 32-bit hardware except for 32-bit ARM. But this is just FreeBSD, and FreeBSD is a weird outlier in the BSD space. A lot of people consider it to be this sort of middle ground between Linux and the more true BSDs. And I think a part of the reason why is FreeBSD sort of does like happily adopt a lot of things that are happening in Linux, like Wayland, like dropping 32-bit support, and various other things of that nature. But when we talk about NetBSD, they still have their i386 version, their 32-bit x86 version, and I had another link here, and I accidentally linked to NetBSD twice. That was supposed to be for OpenBSD. OpenBSD also still has their x86 32-bit version. This is still actively being supported. Now, how long that's going to be the case for either of these projects, only the developers happen to know. And much like the Linux space, there are going to be these random other little projects that either forked off of these or forked off a really long time ago, like Dragonfly BSD, or happen to be just their own little thing in the BSD space that might still have 32-bit support. How long those are, who knows? How well some of those projects are maintained is a whole nother question entirely. Some of those projects haven't had any releases in, 3 or 4 years, so if they're even still being worked on, Whilst losing Debian is a massive hit in this space for supporting 32-bit x86 hardware, it is not the end of the road, and if you're willing to look around, if you're willing to try things out, if you're willing to kind of just do things yourself, you can still do it. It's going to get harder and harder. There will come a point where there are no distros that are still doing this, and you've got to go and compile the kernel yourself and all your tooling yourself, but at the end of the day, the code's still out there, and you can make it work if you really want to, or you can write your own code. So let me know. Do you happen to have an older computer? Do you have it running a 32-bit operating system? And if you do, why is that? Is it something where it literally will not support a 64-bit OS? Or are you just kind of doing it because you like to do it? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video, go subscribe, and if you're on mobile, click the hype button, because that's the thing. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here. Check out the Patreon, subscribe, Daily Bearer Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and now you have no bits.
Money that I don't accept.